Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, September 15th, 2022. President Joe Biden welcoming the late-night tentative agreement between freight rail unions and carriers, heading off a potential strike that could have hurt the economy. President saying this agreement is a big win for America, and this is a great deal for both sides, in my view. Former President Donald Trump says if he's indicted for allegedly mishandling classified documents or something related to the investigation into the attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, he said there will be big problems, and I don't think the people of the United States would stand for it. White House holds a summit titled United We Stand to counter hate-based violence, keynote address by President Biden. The U.S. House passes a bill to prevent a Donald Trump-era executive order that makes it easier to remove some federal employees from ever being reinstated. And we take a closer look at permitting reform, getting energy products, both fossil fuel and clean energy, to the approval stage faster. It was promised to Senator Joe Manchin in exchange for his crucial vote on the Inflation Reduction Act. Now some House Democrats objecting to attaching that to the must-pass government funding bill. We'll get the latest from E&E News congressional reporter George Cahlink. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh tweeting this morning, moments ago, following more than 20 consecutive hours of negotiations at the Labor Department, the rail companies and union negotiators came to a tentative agreement that balances the needs of workers, businesses, and our nation's economy. President Biden quoting this tweet and adding, "This is a win for the economy and the American people. Rail workers will get better pay, improved working conditions, and peace of mind around their health care costs. I thank both the unions and rail companies for negotiating in good faith." President Biden later in the morning speaking in the White House Rose Garden.
As you might guess, I am very pleased to announce a tentative labor agreement that has been reached between the railroad workers and the railway companies. This agreement is a big win for America and for both, in my view. I want to thank the lead negotiators from the labor movement, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, the Trainmen, International Association of Sheet Metal and Air and Rail and Transportation Workers Union, and the other labor unions engaged. And this is a win for tens of thousands of rail workers and for their dignity and the dignity of their work. It's a recognition of that. During these early, dark, uncertain days of the pandemic, they showed up so every American could keep going. They worked tirelessly through the pandemic to ensure that families and communities got the deliveries they needed during these difficult few years. And because of the labor agreement, those rail workers will get better pay, a 24% wage increase over the next 5 years, improved working conditions, peace of mind around their health care by capping the cost that workers will have to pay. And it's about the right to go to a doctor or stay healthy and to make sure you're able to have the care you can afford. It's all part of this agreement. They earned and deserve these benefits. And this is a great deal for both sides, in my view. The agreement is also a victory for railway companies. And I want to thank the lead negotiators from the National Railway Labor Conference and our major rail companies. These companies also played a critical role in keeping America moving during the pandemic, and that's not hyperbole, it's a fact. With this agreement, railroad companies will be able to retain and recruit workers. They'll be able to continue to operate effectively as a vital piece of our economy. They're really the backbone of the economy. I have this visual image of rails being the backbone. I mean, literally, the backbone of the economy. So I thank the unions and the rail companies for negotiating in good faith. They've been up for 20 straight hours through that negotiation and for sticking with it, especially over the last few days. In fact, the negotiators here today, I don't think they've been to bed yet, so I don't want to keep this very long, and they're having to stand besides. Together, we reached an agreement, you reached an agreement that will keep our critical rail system working and avoid disruptions of our economy. And I'm grateful for the members of the administration who worked tirelessly on both sides to help get this done. I especially want to thank Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, a card-carrying union member and the first union labor secretary in decades, for his tireless round-the-clock work. This agreement is validation what I've always believed. Unions and management can work together for the benefit of everyone. They're traveling now, a number of them up, but I want to thank Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, who were deeply involved, along with, I want to thank Deputy Labor Secretary Julie Su, Director of the National Economic Council Brian Deese, and the Deputy National Director of Labor Celeste Drake for this commitment and hard work. To the American people, this agreement can avert the significant damage that any shutdown would have brought. Our nation's rail system is the backbone of our supply chain. Everything you rely on, and it's hard to realize this, from everything from clean water to food to gas to everyday, liquefied natural gas, to everything, every good that you need seems to end up on a rail getting delivered to where it needs to go. With unemployment still near record lows and signs of progress in lowering costs, this agreement allows us to continue to rebuild a better America with an economy that truly works for working people and their families. Today is a win, and I mean this sincerely, a win for America. So I want to thank you all for getting this done, both business and labor. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and may God protect our troops. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Mr. President, when will the railway system come back online?
Mr. President, reaction to migrants being sent to Martha's Vineyard and D.C., sir?
Mr. President, grocery prices are up over 13%. What do you tell struggling Americans?
Rail's moving, it's not going to go up.
The migrants.
Are you confident the situation at the border is under control, Mr. President?
Mr. President, is unpaid sick leave good for workers?
President Joe Biden in the White House Rose Garden late morning. The agreement between the unions and the freight rail carriers also having a positive effect on passenger rail. Amtrak putting out a statement that is working to quickly restore canceled trains and reaching out to impacted customers to accommodate on first available departures. Many of Amtrak's trains run on tracks that are operated and maintained by the freight carriers. On the U.S. Senate floor, some reaction from Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa.
At 12:01 tomorrow morning, our nation's transportation system was set to come to a screeching halt. It now sounds like we have a bit of reprieve, but we still have a threat. Since 2019, railroads and unions have been negotiating a new contract. 2 months ago, President Biden appropriately appointed members of what's called the Presidential Emergency Board. This board recommended the largest pay increase in industry history at 24%, in addition to an annual bonus and health care changes. President Biden promised to be the most pro-union president in history. But even President Biden's recommendations weren't enough for these unions. A few unions continued to hold out and, in fact, took us on the verge of a nationwide strike. A railroad strike would really plunge us back into the supply chain issues that have just now started to somewhat improve. These trains that would be stopped actually carry the food we eat, the gas for our tanks, and the energy that heats our homes. Already, I'm hearing from grain elevator operators in my state that they're having trouble transporting their grain. Hazardous cargo, like the chlorine cities need to purify drinking water, stopped moving earlier this week. Amtrak has canceled long-distance routes. Maybe they're going to be up running now, but at least they were getting ready to stop. But what I just described is the tip of the iceberg unless these unions agree to a long-term deal. The last thing we need is for grain shipments to grind to a halt right as farmers are going to the fields to harvest their grain. Iowa corn and soybeans can't feed the world if they're stuck on the farm or in the local elevator. That's why I co-sponsored Senator Burns' joint resolution to prevent all this. The resolution would mandate that both sides adopt the recommendations of President Biden's emergency board, and then, of course, if we pass that, the trains would keep running. We're just learning about a tentative deal that would let unions back away from the cliff. If they don't, then Congress must step in and pass the joint resolution to keep our economy going. The alternative is unacceptable.
Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, on the Senate floor today in Washington, D.C. Associated Press reporting that the financial terms of the deal closely follow the recommendations made by the PEB, Presidential Emergency Board, last month after those arbiters met with both sides. And now members of all 12 railroad unions will have to vote on these deals. Wall Street today, the Dow down 173, NASDAQ down 167 points, S&P down 44. With the Federal Reserve raising interest rates during this year to deal with high inflation, Freddie Mac saying today that the average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage has now risen above the 6% mark for the first time since 2008. Regulation of cryptocurrency, one of the issues at today's Senate Banking Committee hearing, with testimony from the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler. There is an ongoing debate over whether digital assets should be regulated by the SEC or the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC. Here's Senator Mike Rounds, Republican from South Dakota, questioning the SEC chair about this.
It seems to me that you want to regulate an entire marketplace, but clearly it doesn't appear that you've got rules in place to do so at this time. In my mind, this is simply unacceptable. And I know that your background in the private sector you've got a great history in the private sector, so this is kind of confusing to us. I've heard from a variety of companies who claim they try to work with you and with your organization, but then you turn around and then you've hit them with some pretty heavy enforcement actions or slow walk the process. Mr. Chairman, you keep telling crypto entrepreneurs and the companies to come in and to register. Has anyone actually tried to do that?
To answer your question, there's 6 companies that are actually registered under the disclosure regimes. I would say this: not liking the answer from the SEC doesn't mean there isn't guidance, just with all fairness. And most of these tokens, a vast majority, are securities, and thus the intermediaries are likely to be in non-compliance with securities laws right now. So we're really trying to work with them. We're talking to a wide swath of these organizations right now to get them properly registered, to get them inside the remit. And this is what we do. With all respect to Mr. Levine, we've been pretty clear. My predecessor, Chair Clayton, was through commission actions and in his public voice in front of this committee and others about this matter. And we're going to continue to protect the public as best we can.
Gary Gensler is chair of the SEC Securities and Exchange Commission, questioned by Senator Mike Rounds at today's Banking Committee hearing. Reference to Matt Levine, Bloomberg opinion columnist, who wrote this week, Gary Gensler wants the SEC to have jurisdiction over basically all of crypto because basically every crypto token is a security. But that he does not seem to have any interest in writing new rules to accommodate the crypto market. Gary Gensler's approach would put the SEC in charge of crypto and then more or less ban crypto, and I am not sure that is a winning position for him to take. A paragraph from the column by Matt Levine, and you can find it at Bloomberg.com. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, has sent the latest busloads of migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border to Washington, D.C., dropping off near Vice President Kamala Harris's home, the U.S. Naval Observatory. Governor Abbott tweeting today, "We're sending migrants to her backyard to call on the Biden administration to do its job and secure the border." Migrants coming from Venezuela, Uruguay, Colombia, and Mexico. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre asked today for the Biden administration's reaction.
The the migrants that are being bused to D.C. and other cities. There were some that showed up at the VP's residence earlier this morning. Is the administration looking into whether busing migrants around the country is legal?
So let me just say a couple things about this, because and it's come up in the briefing room before, because this has been happening for the past several weeks. So as we have said repeatedly, there's a process in place. We have had a process in place. There's a legal way of doing this. And for managing migrants, Republican governors interfering in that process and using migrants as political pawns is shameful, is reckless, and just plain wrong. And remember, these are people who are fleeing communism, who are fleeing hardship. And if these governors truly care about border security, they should ask Texas Governor Ted Cruz and Florida Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott why they voted against the president's request for record funding for the Department of Homeland Security. So this is what they have done. These both senators Marco Rubio, Senator Rick Scott, have voted against, did not vote for, this funding that would have helped the Department of Homeland Security. That is just a fact. And also the fact that that Fox News and not the Department of Homeland Security, the city or local NGOs, were alerted about a plan to leave migrants, including children, on the side of a busy DC street makes clear that this is just a cruel, premeditated political stunt. This is what they are doing. And a couple more things. The migrants, including children, who arrived in Martha's Vineyard were misled about where they were being taken and what would be provided when they arrived is also deeply alarming. The children Governor Abbott abandoned in Martha's Vineyard, the children that Governor DeSantis abandoned as well, deserve better. They deserve better than being left on the streets of D.C. or being left in Martha's Vineyard. They deserve a lot better than that. And as we have done many times in response to attempts to create chaos and confusion by Republican governors, we are working to manage the consequences of these two stunts as well.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters today in the White House briefing room. That reference at the end to Martha's Vineyard yesterday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican, flew a plane load of migrants to the island of Martha's Vineyard, part of Massachusetts. A CNN article quoting Governor DeSantis today, "We are not a sanctuary state, and it's better to be able to go to a sanctuary jurisdiction. And yes, we will help facilitate that transport for you to be able to go to greener pastures. Every community in America should be sharing in the burdens. It shouldn't fall all on a handful of red states." That quote from Governor DeSantis. Former President Donald Trump warning that if he is indicted, there would be, quote, problems in this country, the likes of which perhaps we've never seen before. He also said, "I don't think the people of the United States would stand for it." Former President Trump is being investigated by the Justice Department over whether he might have mishandled classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago, Florida home. There are also federal and state investigations going on related to the attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Former President Trump interviewed today on the Hugh Hewitt radio show.
Do you feel like the Department of Justice is trying to indict you, Mr. President?
Well, there is no reason that they can, other than if they're just sick and deranged, which is always possible, because I did absolutely, you've seen the legal papers, absolutely nothing wrong. And there's no reason that they can do that. And I'll tell you what, I would have said there's no way they can raid a house either, because, it's Fourth Amendment stuff, and what they did is terrible. And I don't think the people are going to stand for it. If you noticed, the poll numbers are the highest they've ever been. The people are not going to stand for this stuff. They've weaponized Department of Justice and FBI. And, I don't know how big you've covered it, but I can tell you the biggest story would be, especially if it was reversed, that Danchenko was paid right after 2017, right after it was. So I'm sitting in the Oval Office, and the FBI hired Danchenko to do all sorts of very terrible things. Now, when you think of that story, That's incredible. Danchenko being the Russian. So it was them, with the Russians, not
Well,
me.
the Russia story is over. They are attempting, I think, to indict people for plans to select alternative electors on 1/6. Have you received a target letter, Mr. President?
No, I haven't at all. And frankly, when you look at alternate slates, that's been done for decades and decades, many, many years. Alternate slates are actually common. I wasn't involved with alternate slates, but I can tell you many people have been for many, many years doing alternate slates. In fact, your friend Tucker Carlson did a story on it last night, how it's a very standard way of, working election.
Former President Donald Trump, part of his interview today on the Hugh Hewitt radio show. Former President Trump also saying that if he were to be indicted, that would not deter him from a possible run for president in 2024. On Capitol Hill in Washington, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, chair of the Judiciary Committee, speaking to reporters after a closed-door briefing by FBI and Homeland Security officials about increased threats to law enforcement since the FBI carried out that search warrant on former President Donald Trump's home last month in search of the documents, some of which were marked classified. After some opening remarks, Senator Durbin taking a question about what you just heard former President Trump say.
They gave us indications of the threats that they deal with regularly. At the top of the list was the international drug gangs. You can understand how dangerous they would be. But the next, unfortunately, was the domestic violent extremist. And unfortunately, those are on the rise. More and more people questioning government, questioning authority, and threatening their lives in the process. And we went into questions about how much this has increased. And I will just tell you, it was stunning, the number of threats that have been cataloged and indexed since the August 8th search at Mar-a-Lago. We've seen some of it at the Cincinnati FBI office and other places that is very explicit and specific, and others which are generalized and address the security of each and every federal agent. There's also a concern that more and more personal information can be vulnerable from these agents. They're very careful to protect their personal lives and families, but like members of Congress and other elected officials, they're seeing an increased vulnerability on social media. This was a bipartisan briefing. We had Gary Peters from the HISGAC committee, Republicans as well as Democrats attended. My point to them at the end was, we're behind you. We appreciate what you're doing. You're keeping America safe. And the fact that it is a much more dangerous environment because of the political statements that have been made by some individuals since August 8th is alarming to me. To call these FBI agents who are risking their lives for us vicious monsters was just totally uncalled for. And it's a type of rhetoric which can aggravate the situation and excite their critics. So this is an ongoing issue. It will not be concluded with just this briefing, but we'll be monitoring as we go along. Questions?
Just this morning, former President Trump was saying that if he were to be indicted, that the people wouldn't stand for it. He was asked if that was a suggestion or an incitement to violence. Is it your sense that the DOJ is concerned that if they were to take any action against the former president, that such violence would materialize?
That question was not asked, and I don't know the answer to it, but I can tell you my personal feelings. Inviting the mob to return to the streets is exactly what happened here January 6, 2021. This president knew what he was doing at that rally, and we saw the results. 5 people died and 149 law enforcement agents were injured. His careless and inflammatory rhetoric has its consequences. That's why I believe he is not qualified to serve as president of the United States, nor should he be considered.
Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, chair of the Judiciary Committee, with reporters today after a closed-door briefing from the FBI and the Homeland Security Department about increased threats to law enforcement. There's a story at CNN. Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows has complied with a subpoena from the Justice Department's investigation into events surrounding January 6, 2021. Sources familiar with the matter tell CNN, making him the highest-ranking Trump official, former President Donald Trump's chief of staff, known to have responded to a subpoena in the federal investigation. That from CNN. A fact sheet from the White House today begins today. At the White House, President Biden is hosting the United We Stand Summit to counter the corrosive effects of hate-fueled violence on our democracy and public policy. The summit will honor the resilience of communities who are healing from hateful attacks, including mass shootings from Oak Creek to Orlando, Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Atlanta, Buffalo, and beyond. President Biden himself gave the keynote address.
Our very own intelligence agencies, our own intelligence agencies in the United States of America have determined that domestic terrorism rooted in white supremacy is the greatest terrorist threat to our homeland today. I've been around a while. I never thought I'd hear that or say that. Enough. We need to say clearly and forcefully, white supremacy, all forms of hate fueled by violence have no place in America. Failure to call it out is complicity, my dad would say. If your silence is complicity, we can't remain silent. There's those who say we bring this up, we just divide the country. Bring it up, we silence it instead of remaining silent. For in silence, wounds deepen. We have to face the good, the bad, and the truth. That's what great nations do. And we're a great nation. So we face at this moment, in my view, an inflection point. One of those moments that determine the shape of everything that's going to come after. Our great-grandchildren are going to look back and decide whether or not in this 2, 4, 6, 8 year period we stepped up. Because the world is changing. As the Irish poet said, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. We must choose to be a nation of hope, unity and optimism, or a nation of fear and division and hate.
President Biden at the White House, a summit titled United We Stand. Again, back to the White House fact sheet about this, some of the actions coming out of the summit. The White House says federal agencies announcing new steps to strengthen the resources available to local schools, law enforcement agencies, and cultural institutions like museums and libraries to prevent and respond to hate-fueled violence. And technology companies, including YouTube, Twitch, Microsoft, and Meta, are announcing new actions their platforms are taking to prevent hate-fueled violence. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Wednesday on C-SPAN Radio at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman talks to the Washington Post. And live Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, the Cato Institute has a discussion on the Supreme Court cases from this past term and what to expect when the new term begins in October. Listen to C-SPAN Radio on 90.1 FM in the D.C. metro area and anywhere on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast. Find it on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. A Senate vote on a bill to codify the right to same-sex marriage will not happen until after the November elections. The Hill writes that Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat from Wisconsin's announcement came shortly after retiring Senator Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri, a key vote. Said the bill would be much more likely to get 10 Republican votes to overcome a filibuster if it were considered after Election Day. And the Senate today confirming David Pekoski to be the TSA Administrator, Transportation Security Administration, for a second 5-year term. The vote was 77-18. The U.S. House today passing a bill designed to ensure federal civil service protections for thousands of federal employees. In 2020, former President Trump had issued an executive order that reclassified some workers who dealt with policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating to become at-will employees under a new schedule called Schedule F. President Biden repealed that executive order, but former President Trump says he would reinstate it if he becomes president again. So House Democrats bringing up a bill that would prevent that possibility. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, Democrat of New York, chairs the Oversight and Reform Committee.
Career federal workers serve both Democratic and Republican administrations. They do their jobs guided by their expertise and best judgment, not by allegiance to any political agenda. In 2020, former President Trump issued an executive order creating a new federal employee classification in the accepted service called Schedule F. Employees transferred to Schedule F would have been stripped of workplace protections and converted to at-will employees. If the order had been fully implemented, it could have harmed tens of thousands of federal employees. Agencies were directed to identify civil service positions with a policy-making function to convert to Schedule F, who would be more easily removed from their jobs for not rubber stamping the president's political agenda. Presumably, those positions could then be filled with people who would be more loyal to President Trump. Fortunately, one of the first things that President Biden did upon taking office was to revoke the Schedule F executive order. But the order still shocked the federal workforce. Such an attack against the integrity of the civil service should shock all of us, particularly as members of Congress. We depend on the federal workforce to serve impartially and in accordance with the law.
Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, chair of the Oversight and Reform Committee, Democrat from New York, on the House floor today. Opposing this bill, the ranking Republican on the committee, James Comer of Kentucky.
What is the problem the bill tries to address? The Democrats seeks to prevent future presidents making federal employees more accountable to the American people whom they serve. Our founding fathers never envisioned a massive, unelected, unaccountable federal government with the power to create policies that impact Americans' everyday lives. But that's currently the state of today's federal bureaucracy. President Trump sought to take on this bureaucracy and restore power to the people by draining the swamp. He issued an executive order on October 2020 to help make federal bureaucrats who have the ability to create and implement policy more accountable for their actions. We should all be in favor of policies making it easier to remove civil servants who refuse to follow the will of the voters. That's what President Trump's executive order did. Democrats are beholden to the federal bureaucracy, a workforce who thinks they know better than the American people. They are wrong.
Congressman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, ranking member on the Oversight and Reform Committee on the House floor. The House went on to pass this bill. Vote was 225 to 204. 6 Republicans joining all Democrats in voting yes. The bill now goes to the Senate. House today also passing legislation intended to make it harder for future presidents to interfere with the census that happens once every 10 years. Also in response to former President Trump's failed effort to make a citizenship question part of the 2020 census. A headline at E&E News, House Dem leaders scramble permitting reform effort. This refers to Senator Joe Manchin's attempt to make it easier to get energy project permits, both fossil fuel and clean energy approved. Senator Manchin agreed to be the deciding vote passing another bill, the big spending and tax bill dealing with health care and clean energy, known as the Inflation Reduction Act, if he could get the permitting reform separately. But the question is whether it will be or not be part of the must-pass federal government funding measure called a Continuing Resolution, or CR, that needs to become law before October 1st to prevent a government shutdown. Coming up, we'll be talking with that E&E News reporter who wrote the article for some of the comments this week about this. We'll start with a question to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York.
Yes. Were you surprised by the potential problem about the Manchin agreement here with progressives and liberals concerned about the environment?
The bottom line is very simple, and the permitting agreement is part of the IRA agreement. I'm going to add it to the CR, and it'll pass.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries, also from New York, asked about it.
Going back to the CR permitting debate, there are a lot of members of your caucus who are essentially, threatening to shut down the government because of their opposition to this. What is your message to them? And how does that sort of talk right before the midterms, do you think, affect your all's chances?
We're going to continue to have family conversations as we've consistently done. Apparently, we weren't going to be able to pass the American Rescue Plan. We did it. We weren't going to be able to deal with infrastructure. We did it. There was a big discussion around whether we could get gun safety over the finish line. We did it. What's going to happen? Are you going to be able to get things together with the Competes Act and USICA? We did it, the Chips and Science Act. Well, seems like the whole effort to make a meaningful investment in climate change is going to fall apart. We did it, the Inflation Reduction Act. So, pretty confident that we'll continue to have conversations with each other, articulate a variety of different perspectives, but at the end of the day, what we always do as House Democrats is arrive at the highest common denominator.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, that was on Wednesday. For the Republican point of view on this issue, Senator Sen Barrasso of Wyoming, ranking member on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, said on Tuesday that although Republicans might support making it easier to get the energy projects approved and speeding up the permitting process, most Republicans are not going to support Senator Manchin's effort because it was part of that deal, including passage of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Now we have Joe Manchin, who's trying to hide behind a fig leaf of an agreement he made with Chuck Schumer about trying to cut a little bit of that red tape. Well, I would say to my friend Joe Manchin, who is the chairman of the Energy Committee, that what they're celebrating today at the White House is the damage you have already done by passing this reckless bill. You voted for it. And if you're now looking for Republicans to support and give you more cover than you have right now, you're not going to find it with us.
That's Senator Sen Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming, on Tuesday. George Cahlink is a congressional reporter for E&E News and has been tracking this issue. He joins us now by phone. So we got 2 weeks to go until the government funding bill needs to become law. Where do things stand with this permitting reform?
Great. Thanks for having me. First off, Michael, permitting reform has definitely become one of the hot topics on the Hill this week. As part of the big reconciliation package Democrats passed this summer in order to get the decisive vote from Joe Manchin, they agreed that they would pass separate legislation to overhaul federal energy permitting laws. And Manchin says he has a deal that will be done as part of the stopgap spending bill that Congress has to pass by September 30th to keep the government opened. And it seemed like it was headed that way. But then this week we're seeing some progressives coming out against that plan. And then just yesterday, midweek, Nancy Pelosi said, hold off, we don't have an agreement that this has to ride on the CR. We could take it up sometime, but no guarantee it goes on the CR. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now whether the permitting law will be coming up at all before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th.
What specific reforms does Joe Manchin want, and do the House Democratic Progressives say we won't accept anything, or perhaps there's a compromise to be had?
Yeah, no, I mean, Manchin's, is very sort of moderate to conservative for a Democrat on energy issues, and a lot of the permitting reforms he wants are things aimed at really streamlining the licensing process, so things like pipelines and transmission lines can get built faster. And he's also a major advocate for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which would run through his state. Progressives really see this as a side deal that was made, and they worry that it will benefit fossil fuel companies. They worry it will lead to more pipelines, make it easier to circumvent, environmental laws, environmental reviews. So they're pretty united against this. I don't think there's a deal to be had with the progressives, but I do think there are a good number of moderate Democrats who are open to some of these permitting reforms. One of the big arguments is that permitting reforms can make it easier to produce energy, including some renewable energy, and that could help lower energy prices.
The Republicans on this are in an interesting position. They might favor the reform, but they don't like how we got here.
Yeah, Republicans really, they've long pushed for permitting reform. If they were to control either chamber of Congress, they would probably push their own permitting bill. But I don't see that they're in the mood right now to reward Democrats and allow them to pass this bipartisan bill. Especially a lot of them are frustrated with Joe Manchin. You know, he made a deal with Democrats to pass reconciliation. So why would they be in any mood to pass his legislation? So I think if Democrats want to move this, they might largely be on their own, and that won't be enough in the Senate where you need 60 votes to do anything.
We're talking with George Cahlink from E&E News. Looking at the larger political situation here, what's going on between Senator Joe Manchin and the House Democratic progressives, where they don't feel that they need to abide by an agreement that Manchin made with Schumer? What's the history here?
Yeah, well, I mean, progressives have never felt like Manchin was on their side when it comes to environmental issues. You know, he's, you know, as the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, he's been a pro-coal senator coming from West Virginia. You know, he's been very cautious on anything to do with climate change, and he really pushed for scaling back a lot of the climate spending that a lot of progressives have wanted. One Republican lawmaker said what progressive Democrats are doing now is to get even with Joe Manchin move. They feel like he blocked them from passing the broader reconciliation bill that they would have wanted a year ago that would have provided trillions potentially for climate spending, narrowed it down to under $300 billion. And they're not in any mood to give them a win on permitting reform. And they feel that the deal was between Schumer and Manchin and the Senate. They don't see it as a House deal.
George Cahlink, congressional reporter for E&E News. Find his stories at eenews.net and on Twitter at George Cahlink. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
A White House monkeypox response team update today. The CDC Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, saying that there are almost 23,000 cases of monkeypox identified in the U.S. and that the overall rate of new cases is declining, but that some areas of the country are seeing a rise. More from the White House monkeypox response coordinator, Robert Fenton.
Over the last couple of weeks, our large event pilot has been incredibly successful. Over 3,300 shots were administered at Southern Decadence in New Orleans. Over 1,000 shots were administered at Oakland Pride, and over 4,000 shots were administered at Black Pride in Atlanta. And we recently were notified that Charlotte administered an additional 1,500 doses in the days and events following Charlotte Pride last month, bringing the total vaccine administration as part of the pilot program to nearly 11,000 doses. Importantly, these efforts are reaching Black and brown communities, a top priority of this administration. By vaccinating thousands of people at high risk who might not otherwise have gotten a shot, this program is working to advance equity and combat this outbreak. We continue to build on this work by making additional vaccines available for large and small equity interventions across the country, which Dr. Daskalakis will talk about more. Stepping back, we're seeing the impact of the administration's comprehensive strategy to fight monkeypox in the latest case trends and other promising data points. Overall, new case numbers are down nearly 50% since early August. And in places like Atlanta, where we've worked closely with the public health community to surge vaccines and information around events like Black Pride, the rate of new cases has steadily declined. And in D.C., the new cases have declined 20% on average per week since a peak in mid-July. And knowledge of our tools and interests in using them has increased. According to research released today from the University of Pennsylvania, knowledge of a monkeypox vaccine has jumped from approximately a third of Americans to over 60%. More than 2/3 of Americans understand the risk profile and behaviors from monkeypox. And nearly 3/4 of Americans said they would get vaccinated if exposed to monkeypox.
The White House monkeypox response coordinator, Robert Fenton, part of today's virtual briefing. The CDC also announcing that applications now being accepted for a monkeypox vaccine equity pilot program from state, local, and tribal governments. The program is to, quote, reach populations that may face barriers to monkeypox vaccination, which may include differences in language, location of vaccination sites, vaccine hesitancy, mistrust of government, lack of access to online scheduling technology, accessibility disability issues, immigration status, and stigma. Now to foreign affairs. Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting today with Chinese President Xi Jinping at a summit in Uzbekistan. The Russian president thanking what he calls the well-balanced position of our Chinese friends in connection with the Ukrainian crisis, and also saying he was ready to discuss questions and concerns by China about Ukraine. In Washington, there was testimony by a volunteer Ukrainian medic captured in Mariupol, Ukraine in March by Russian forces, tortured and released after 3 months. She testified before the U.S. government agency called the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission.
My name is Yulia Payevska. My grandfather was a World War II hero. Now, as my country is at war, I'm a paramedic. My mission is saving life. Russians call me Nazi, like they call everyone, every Ukrainian who fights them or simply doesn't want Russia in Ukraine. The first 20 days of this war I spent in Mariupol, which was hell. After that, I spent 3 months in Russian captivity, which was hell too. I'm not the one to make politician speeches. I'm not a politician. Let me just tell you the stories of which I was witness. Curiosity is one of the reasons, along with perseverance, excuse me, and confidence in one rightness which allowed me to survive in hell. When my tormentors advised me to commit suicide, I thought, no, I will see that happen tomorrow. I wonder how far they can go in their madness and anger. And then one day, when it seems there was no hope, someone looks into the peephole and calls my name. Get your things and get out. This is how my journey to freedom began.
Volunteer medic before the Helsinki Commission in Washington. The commission, a U.S. government agency that is comprised of members of the U.S. House and Senate and also cabinet officials. Congressman Joe Wilson, Republican from South Carolina, on the commission today after hearing the witnesses saying it's critical that the world hear the stories of those who endured the worst under captivity. Evidence is essential to the prosecution of war crimes. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word to get more of Washington's top stories sent to you every day. You can subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.